So here we go. Thanks to Klaus for reminding me of things that I completely forgotten or never actually noticed at the time. I should say that I'm not still Klaus's PhD supervisor. He has actually handed in a PhD thesis some years after the event. Okay, so just do the usual Inigo Montoya thing here. You know, hello, my name is, you killed my father, prepare to die. Hello, my name is Peter Dalgaard. I've been on the R core team since 1997, and today I'll be talking to you about the history of R and a little about the future. And maybe that is going to be a very little about the future because congratulations and all that stuff, right? So let's start somewhere. When we released R version 1.0.0, someone got the great idea of making a commemorative CD in, I think, 15 copies actually. And that should be signed by all members of the core team. And it looks like this. This one is on display in Auckland. They have sort of a rather grand way with things. So they have this large display near one of their auditoriums with a R on the side and a glass box and everything. And I've got one as well. It doesn't live quite as prominently. It lives a little bit more modestly in a cardboard box in my office, but it actually exists. I brought it along just to prove that it does exist physically. So zooming in a little bit more, it looks like this. So did I say it took about 1.5 years to get all the signatures collected because it had to travel all the way around the world several times with people carrying it along to conferences and getting the signature of, I think Guido Massarotto was the hardest one to actually obtain. Very people actually met him in person. And there was a joke going on at some point that it was actually Brian Ripley in disguise. Because no one else seemed to have actually met the guy. Anyway, so what's on the CD? It's got signatures of the members of the core team at the time of R version 1.0.0. So there's a list of names there, and I could probably talk half an hour about each of them, but I won't do that. So that's what's on the CD. Yeah, okay. What's on the CD is a copy of CRAN, dated, I think, March 13, 2000. So a few days, a few weeks after the release, so there was time to make actual binary versions and so forth. And I checked that I could actually read the CD, and if you look closely at the picture I had before, you could see that I actually also have a CD drive still. And I started, put it in and browsed around, and then the computer died. But I actually managed to make a copy of the contents. So this is what's on it. And this is, some things here don't quite work the way they used to do, but the idea is that this actually is CRAN. So if I click on the, where the hell is it? This thing here, it should open up in the browser, and then it should show you the opening page of CRAN from back then with the prominent note at the top that R 1.0.0 has been released. And then there's various other stuff on the CD which we won't have the time to go into in any great detail. I've made a few notes about what you can actually see on it. One thing you can see is that, so this is where we have the official releases. And so there it is, R 1.0.0.tgz, which it was called in those days because Windows didn't allow longer file names, so it couldn't be .tar.gz, I think. You will also notice that it's got this version, these versions down here. That's the release split into 3 parts because it would fit onto a floppy disk, each part then. Do you remember floppy disks? The little plastic things that looks like a 3D print of the save icon, right? Okay, so let's go back to the slides. Should be over here. Come on, Dalgaard. Here we go. So, what is there to notice about the CD? Well, as I told you, splitting for floppies was still a thing at the time. Very few, not every computer had a CD drive, so it would be people downloading the stuff at work and wanting to take it home would want to put it onto three floppies and play with it at home. At least that was the idea. Another thing you'll see is that even though the original version of R was made for Macintosh computers, there was no Mac version in 2000 because basically Apple had been mucking around with their operating system, so that some of the things that you could do in R, like dynamic loading and things like that, were exceedingly difficult in that version of the Mac OS. So it wasn't actually until OS X arrived in 2005 that we started making versions for the Mac. Another thing to notice is that CRAN's infrastructure was actually in place at the time. So this is something that is sometimes forgotten, is that CRAN predates R version 1.0.0 and various other aspects of R by quite some time. So at the time we released 1.0.0, CRAN had a whopping 53 packages. You can count them on the CD. But of course they weren't just any old packages, because they had important stuff like Survival, a port of the S version by Thomas Lumley, and had NLME for mixed effects models. And that stuff was very instrumental in deciding that we were at a point where we could release something and call it R version 1.0.0, because then the system would have most of the things that people would actually want to do with statistics. So we were covering most of the bases of what should be in a generic statistical system at the time. One other thing to look at, to notice, is that CRAN doesn't actually look very much different today. There have been various attempts to modernize it, but it sort of dies on the contents of CRAN being a very complex beast, and so you don't really just change the style file and then it just looks better and it's all the same thing. If you try that, something will break, and it's not something that we want to break. Also, if you looked at the list of prior releases that I showed you, you will find that they go back to 1997 or maybe even 1996. So what this indicates is that R didn't just throw itself on the market on the 29th of February, year 2000. There was actually a period leading up to that of substantial activity and prehistory. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the prehistory on this slide here. So just outlining it, it will necessarily have to be in bullet points like this. So the whole thing started in 1992 or in 93. The jury's a little bit out on where to put the birthday. I think Significance put it in 1993 for the 25th anniversary issue. So it started locally in Auckland with Ross and Robert. They actually wanted to run S+, but their computer labs were filled with Macintoshes. So they said, oh, well, let's just roll our own and try that on the students. And they survived, barely. I heard. At least some of the early versions of R contains an excuse to the students or an apology to the students for inflicting early versions of R on them. So that happened, and then it sort of stayed local for a couple of years until Martin Mechler visited Auckland, and he was very much into public domain or free software business. So he convinced R&R, that's Ross and Robert, to release under the GNU public license in 1995, and then suddenly things began to explode. So we had the mailing list formation in 1996, where we could, at the beginning, we could discuss development of R, and it's split into R help and R devel at some pretty early point. I forgot when. And then in 1997, Kurt and Fritz in Vienna got the idea of creating CRAN or CRAN. People are sort of a little bit confused on how to pronounce that because we just write it usually, but it's modeled on similar repositories for Perl and Tech, and CPAN and CTAN isn't all that easy to. So that's CRAN, CPAN and CTAN, so this would be CRAN, but there were also jokes of having things like Java beans, so that should be cranberries. That never really panned out. Anyway, so they did that fairly early in 1997, and a bit later in 1997, August 16 to be precise, Ross and Robert sent a mail to key persons, including Kurt and Thomas Lumley and me, talking about defining an actual R core, or taking the 4 people that had been working on R at the time and extending it to a fuller core team. So that happened in August 1997. And then lots of things happened. People started working on debugging the code that existed for R. There were a couple of critical bugs that took us a while to sort out, usually memory protection bugs, which people still run into if they're not careful. But at that time, we had them in R itself. Some tidying up of the release procedures. That was mostly my job, trying to find suitable ways of staging a release of R and having alpha, beta, release candidate releases and all that, and figuring out what people were allowed to do in various phases, and having the split between a release branch and a development branch. All of that stuff was being developed at the time. I won't bother you with the details, partly because I can't remember all of them. At the same time, CRAN and people around that developed the notion of a formalized R package, which is actually quite unique because other repositories didn't quite have that system of defining something that they would call a package, and which would have a uniform format that could be checked and could be installed easily on people's computers. I'll get back to that in a second. So this stuff happened during basically 1997 and 1998. And then in all that time, the core team were sitting in their various offices in Auckland. Some people were in the US, some people were in Copenhagen, some people were in Austria, some were in Switzerland, but we never actually met in person until 1999 in Vienna. So there was this DSC conference organized by Kurt, who had a grants for distributed statistical computing, which got abused to get people together in Vienna. So on that occasion, the core team got together for the first time, and we discussed where we were and how far we were away from a 1.0.0 release. And we made the decision, I think it was Rossi Haka's suggestion, to choose the well-known nerdy dates of the exception from the leap day rule. I suppose you all know the joke, that's the story that there's not a 29th, there's only a 29th of February on years that are divisible by 4, except if they're divisible by 100, except if they're divisible by 400. So 2000 is the exception from the exception. So there actually is a 29th of February in 2000, which was the story about the Y2K mess up and so forth, that people got the date count wrong. Okay, so this is the DSC in 99, and if you look very carefully over there, you will see a younger version of me. And there's something about this picture which, the combination of having Andreas and Duncan in the foreground here, and the very tall doorways in the University of Vienna, makes me look very, very small in that picture. Okay, but so this is the DSC in 99, and as you will notice, it's not a very big conference, but it could basically contain everyone interested in statistical computing at the time. So, going a little bit further back, one has to say that there was something driving the. Klaus, can you get this the minute count up there again? So something was behind this rapid development. I mean, there was something in the air that made these things happen at that kind of pace. And so I should just spend a few lines on outlining what was going on in statistical computing at the time. So first of all, the PC was entering the market. I mean, it had been there since 1980, but it was sort of an exclusive thing. It cost a month's salary or more to buy a PC at that time, or before that. They were becoming cheaper, they were becoming more capable, and at the same time, people were interested in working with free software. So we have, oops, that way. Linux was entering the scene, had come in 91. There was the general public license and free software. There was the whole ethos of, if you participated in this free software movement, you could actually get quite a lot of features by contributing just a little to various projects. So there were a lot of people interested in that scene. Within statistics, we were still sort of stuck on mainframe computers or department computers. The dominant statistical software was SAS, with fringe markets for GenStat and S+ and things like that, various other things as well. The main feature of those was that they were actually quite expensive, especially if you wanted them on your PC. So if you wanted to do statistics on your PC at home, you could buy a very expensive PC, and then you could pay about as much as you paid for the PC per year to have a license for SAS or for some of the other things. Right? So they were, at that time, very expensive. They were geared towards corporate use of the software, so they were expecting to sell very few copies at a very high price, and rather than selling a lot of copies at a very low price, as the market has changed to. So people were, at the time, developing statistical software. Various things were around. The back pages of Breslow and Day's book on case control had a, I think they spent a third of the book on containing a Fortran program. Oh, not all that much, but anyway, so there was a Fortran program printed in the back of a book. If you wanted to run the software, well, just key it in and run it. Or maybe you had connections so that you could get things on a tape. The important thing was that, or not the important thing, but typically every developer would use its own method. So they would use the Fortran compiler they had available, or they would program in Turbo Pascal or whatever. There was each project their own platform. So if you wanted to use the survival software from X institution, you'd have to sort of find out how to port the stuff to your own system or adopt their system. So it was not easy even to run software developed in the statistical world, and it was not easy at all to integrate new methods in statistical platforms. So you could wait for half a decade before SAS would actually do survival analysis and things like that. So it was a bit stifled. So just remind you about SAS. Everyone used it. Everyone who wanted to do something a little bit out of the ordinary were a bit annoyed with it. So it had this separation between data steps. You could run things on your data set, then you had a proc step in which you could run various statistical analysis, and then you could select from a finite set of possible statistical analysis, right, using this way. Actually, this data step was quite flexible, but it felt very clunky in use. It had this feature that the only real data structure was the data set, and it was only programmable via a rather strange macro language, which was mastered by quite a few persons. Mastered by, no, not mastered by quite a few, but mastered by a few. Very few people knew how to do that. Okay. In contrast, we had S, which was attractive to people. It was a full programming language. It allowed you to integrate data handling and analysis. It had a rather nice, at least for the time, graphic subsystem. You could have the model formulas which were inherited from GenStat, and it allowed you to do seamless programming of extensions. So, and what was rather important from a programmer point of view, it had this feature that you could dynamically load C or Fortran code. And this was one thing that became much easier with R, because to do it with S, you needed to have exactly the same compiler that S had been compiled with. So this was one of the real starters for the R development, is that people could actually write their code in C and Fortran and have it integrated into the system. So CRAN was also instrumental in getting things running and tidied up. So what it actually did was it created a marketplace for the decentralized development of packages. So it didn't become the responsibility of the core team to write every statistical method in sight. We could concentrate on getting the call working, getting the mechanics working, and the CRAN team worked on defining the R package so that it became easy to install, and it ensured that there was at least a minimum level of documentation, and was the problem at the time is that it ensured that packages could be maintained, and it could be ensured that people who wrote packages would actually be keeping up with changes in the computing platform, rather than just saying, hey, I did this, here's my code, you figure out how to do with it, right? Which was sort of the ethos before then. Okay, so what happened after that? I have to be careful with the time, I can see. In the first decade, so I've got two slides here saying what happened 2000 to 2010, what happened 2010 until now. So the first decade had a series of incremental improvements to the core language. So we got the new garbage collector, we got large vectors, we got the byte compiler, we got automation, both in the package checking area and in the release procedures. Things were pretty soon realized that the only thing we could get these things to work was to have some level of automation. We had the R Foundation, and first of all, primarily what we saw was there was an explosive interest in R, both from users of R and from new developers of R. So books came out, the mailing list volume increased to like 10,000 messages per year on R help. CRAN packages, Dirk will have the actual numbers here, but we started reaching 10,000 plus packages where we started with about 50, right? Was becoming a bit unwieldy to sort out what the various packages or which packages were actually available. So we got things like the CRAN task views and things like that. We found the conferences, first conference in Vienna, that was a classroom size. I think we were 25 people in that room you saw. And as I said, it's gathered almost everyone who were actually seriously playing with statistical computing in various aspects. And we had a newsletter which we developed into the R journal in about 2009. So let's just see. So I showed you the, should have done that. Here we go. So this was the DSC in 1999. In 2008, we were in Dortmund for the Use R, and we had to take the biggest auditorium in the building, 800 people or something like that. And the year after we were in Rennes, and they didn't actually have an auditorium big enough, so they had to build one. We were outside in a big tent like that. Okay, so what happened after that? There's a little bit of a gap in my attention to what happened there. I kept doing my releases and so forth, but I also changed jobs in 2010, and so I had to sort of concentrate on business students and actually do some courses and so forth. Well, there's this famous John Lennon quote here that some things happened while I was busy making others' plans. And I still actually have that. If I look at my mail folders, R help has 48,000 unread R help messages collected from 2010 to 2014. So what else happened? We got the cutesy names. That was designed or planned, decided in 2011. And somehow, without me actually looking, R had suddenly become mainstream. I found myself, the first couple of years I taught at the CBS, I was sort of explaining, we've got this little system it's actually quite capable and blah, 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 blah. And then after a few years, you realize you don't have to explain that. It's mainstream. You can just say we're using R, right? So Microsoft got involved. We've got the R Consortium in 2014. We've got Studio entered the scene, which, of course, lots of things can be said about, but just very briefly say that they've got the shell of the RStudio, which was useful for many people. There was also this prescriptive culture of actually helping users, saying, okay, to do this, you have to do that, where the original ethos of the our help mailing list was that you have to figure out how things work, and then you can figure out how to do it yourself. Whereas RStudio was much better at easing the entry for new users. So the Hadleyverse, the Tidyverse, got on the scene. We got ggplot. Data science was beginning to be a thing, saying that, okay, statistics is not just about fitting models, it's also about actually getting the data in to fit the models. We also saw that the mailing list traffic died down, so nowadays there's much fewer traffic on our help. It moved to platforms like Stack Exchange or even Twitter, even though Twitter is a horrible platform for actually getting help because you can't put 280 characters. And it has a tendency to forget what happened yesterday. Good. Okay, so what's going on in the present and immediate future? We've got R 4.0.0 coming up. For release dynamics reasons, it couldn't be at this date. It will have to be later in the year. It will probably be April 24. But today we actually have the release of R 3.6.3, which will happen in a few moments if I can get my act together here. So let's do it. So the thing that happens when you do a release is the following. Actually, most of it happens automatically nowadays. So there's a cron job which does most of the job. And you can check that it's actually done the job. It started at 9 o'clock this morning, and it did a lot of stuff which I used to do by hand, but now I just have the cron job running it. And the important thing is that you check to the end here and see that it actually created this guy here. Okay, so the remaining steps of a release is actually just to change a few websites and write an email. So to do that, I should go to this screen here, that's the email. Before that, I need to go to my office computer and run a few things. So run in, let's see if this works. Here we go. So this will generate the stuff that needs to be changed on the websites. So I should be able to go in and find the index.html here. And the thing that I need to change is I need to change this stuff here to this stuff here. Oh, cross fingers. There we go. I got too much in here. Doesn't look right. That's it. So This one also needs to change. So that's the same story. I need to take this stuff here. Oops. Oh shit. These lines here. That need to replace this stuff here, and usually the previous release also dies at this point. Here we go. So save this time, and then I'll explain what this happened. I need to do the other things first. So I need to write the email. So in order to do that, I need to generate the checksums. Yeah. So these do the MD5 sums, and I need to copy those. Mail, just kill these lines just for good measure. One set, the other set was this stuff here. So, and the final thing is that we need to look at the top of the news file, which I happen to know doesn't have all that many entries for 363. There we go. Changes in 363. There, and that's supposed to be it. Maybe double check that it doesn't say 362 anywhere anymore. There we go. So when I click send, it should be officially released. Okay, then the only thing that I usually do about that is that I also make tweets. No. So that's it. If you want to
between unbelievably brave and unbelievably manual still. I mean, I can't type 5 characters on in a lecture hall when I'm in front and talking with people. Doing sort of all those steps by hand is very impressive. So, chapeau again.
You should have seen the stuff that's been automated. That's that was the thing that 20 years ago, when that was the thing I did by hand, and that's probably why I have been sort of a little bit unattentive to the fact that my PhD student was becoming a father for the first time. But it really did require quite a lot of concentration to get it right. Anyway, so here's the windsock, and you will notice that, of course, it's the Peanuts strip from February 29, 2000. Okay, so we might also need this one, just for the last few slides. How much time did I have?
You have. I will start the music in 3 minutes.
In 3 minutes, okay, so yeah, so what's going on in the immediate future is we'll probably continue doing defensive maintenance and long-haul improvements. So defensive maintenance, there's things like what happens with new compilers. Will they start acting up, or will R start acting up on new compilers? Updating LAPACK. We did that for the 3.6.3 versions, only to realize that the new version of LAPACK couldn't actually calculate the Frobenius norm if there are NA values in the matrix, which, for crying out loud, is just the sum of squares, damn it. But it still managed to do it wrong, so we spent most of last week trying to actually figure out what was going on and fix the bug upstreams. Luke is working on the alt-rep, the alternative representation works, probably reference counting, improve garbage collection by actually counting how many times an object is used will come in pretty soon. The character set issues are a bit on the table. Looking at maybe moving to UTF-8 as far as we can, and things like that. Okay. Longer term issues, we have some aspects of, or some challenges as it's called these days. Probably the most important one is that we need somehow to work on the rejuvenation of R. And the thing that I showed you before was the peanut strip that got used for the release of 3.5.3, so about a year ago. That was released on 2019, March 11. So I used the Peanuts strip from 1959, March 11, which also happens to be the day on which I was born. So the great truth is that we're all getting older. And the core team was 40-ish in 1999. Now we are... Now we're around 60, so something is going to happen. We have to be careful not to have too many single points of failure, which we don't actually have all that many. All this release stuff, I have this coded up so that someone could actually just grab my code and execute most of it and take a step into my shoes. I think the worst problem we have is with the Macintosh, where the only person who really knows what the hell is going on is Simon, but he's younger than the rest of us, so maybe it goes anyway. And so governance has been an issue. The R Foundation has been very hard to get to an operative level. It's actually quite well working at this point with regular board meetings, open meetings and so forth, but it's still somewhat fragile. It's quite kind of hard to make strategic decisions. We've got, of course, being in the STEM area, we've got diversity issues, which actually have a slide on, but maybe the congratulations will save me from that. And also, maybe we do have a little bit of a tendency to a fragmentation of the user base. We're sort of seeing some tension between the data science crowd and the statistical methodology crowd, and whether that is a problem or not is sort of a little bit up for debate. Good, so this is what I'm not going to talk about. And apart from that, I'm just going to say thank you for your attention. Right.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for not having forcing me to play Cliff Richards. Congratulations. So I think we have room for one very quick question. If anyone has a quick comment or question that they would want to go to Peter. Yeah.
How do you choose the names for the releases?
How we choose
That's
the name?
not a short answer. That's common.
That's, there's a 20-minute talk given in Brisbane in 2018, which is probably still on the net at some point. But it usually is looking through Peanuts archives, finding something that's appropriate for the time. It's not, and the power of choosing the name is mine. So that's the short story.